This evening, we're going to talk about the second part of chapter 3, which I requested we treat as a separate recording because it's huge and it, in a way, is the heart of the thesis. It's the heart of the method. So I've called it, it's trying to describe a method of exegesis that Steiner himself did not articulate. This is part of the task of this thesis, is that Steiner himself did not consider it, or did not claim to be academic or, theological or systematic. He just presented his lectures, he wrote some books. And so I've kind of sifted through his stuff and have defined a few things. In chapter 2, in the theological section, I defined his hermeneutical key, not I, but Christ in I, or in me, and his conceptual model, which is the theosis in Christ, the becoming divine in Christ, which are not, revolutionary models or keys. They well-known models in theology. And I sort of kind of did that in a way to align him more closely with people who may have questions about where he's coming from. So I'm going to try and break this third section into, or the second section into 3 parts, which is a little bit about what is contemplative phenomenology, which is the word that I've given for his method of exegesis, if we want to pin it down to a precise definition. And in this section, because it's a theological thesis, I have focused the questions to give single examples. Each of these examples can be unpacked. For example, when we talk about the senses, I choose one sense, not a dozen. And in the same way, in the schooling path, I have in the third section talked about a biblical method of developing this method rather than some of the other ways that Steiner describes. So it's one of the unique things that Steiner brings is he describes a number of ways of developing knowledge of the higher worlds, which is one of his famous books. And I'm going to focus here because it's about how do we develop a method of exegesis for theology. So it may not be universally scientifically applicable, but it stands within the sciences of the world. So I've named three aspects to this. The one is the imitatio, or the imitation of Jesus, as in conjunction with the imitation of Christ. So when we go there, this is one of the big spoilers for the second half of the thesis, is that Steiner brings back the Nestorian heresy, which is that, Christ was not made human through the birth of Jesus through Mary. So the fully divine and the fully human aspect of Jesus Christ is that Jesus was a fully human being, and Christ was the divine human being who then incarnated into that body at the baptism in the Jordan. So there was what's called a diophysitism, which is a dual genesis of that being, one human and one divine. And that was considered to be a heresy at one point. I think we dealt with that a little bit last time. But it's really quite important, because in this method, how do we imitate the path of Jesus into selflessness, which is the sort of a core schooling that I have found, common to, say, Sarah Coakley, Hildegard of Bingen. The mystic path is an emptying out so that the Christ can transform my soul, whereas the imitation of Christ is another layer that comes to that. And I'm going to try and describe some of that this evening. Then the second part is, understanding the spiritual senses in the Western tradition a bit more. And then thirdly, the scriptural or the biblical basis of using symbol and art, or using scripture as a symbol and an art form for our contemplation to perceive the higher reality behind it. And those are the 3 steps of the contemplative phenomenology that I'm trying to describe here. So let's see where we go with that. In this sense of using the symbol and the art, Elaine Page really works with that, the Gnostics used scripture as a symbol, not as a literal text. Secondly, Sarah Coakley also talks about the building of the spiritual senses, and in that sense, Steiner and her agree that this has a lot to do with what Paul calls the development of the inner person in his letters. So the development of the inner person, and the methods are universal in a way. They in many of the theological parts of the world, these three steps are defined in some form or other. So the first thing that we need to sort of understand with that is that Steiner talks about three sets of senses. So when you look at Sarah Coakley's work, where she's trying to define the Western tradition of the spiritual senses, she's just talking about, or not just, but she talks about, we have the physical senses and then we have the spiritual senses. And her question with her colleagues is, are these metaphorical or are they analog? In other words, when you say, I can smell the divine or I can see the divine, is that a metaphor? Because we're just using the images of the physical world to try and explain a spiritual experience, or are they actually analog? And they make a decision that they're analog. In other words, that there is a definite correlation between the spiritual senses and the physical senses. They're another set that work together with that. Whereas Steiner, one of the things that really became clear for me during my research, which hadn't been clear up until then after 35 years of reading, but in sort of trying to describe Steiner's description, I suddenly realized, you know what? He's describing three sets of spiritual senses. This is especially if you read the book Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, and it's follow on the stages of initiation. That he really talks about the soul and spiritual senses, and his language is often a bit blurry, where he goes the soul and spiritual senses, but he really talks about how we have a set of senses that we develop to see into the soul world, and then within that another layer of the spiritual senses unfold as a sort of and these three work in union with each other. And that's why it's important to understand the threefold nature that Steiner brings. We are a being who operate in the physical world. We have an aspect that operate in the soul lands, or what Steiner calls the astral world. And then we have the spiritual aspect of the human being that operates in the spirit lands. And they each require a different way of perception and cognizing, which is quite an important step. So in that sense, how does that happen? How do the senses transform? And Steiner was schooled through Goethe, and Goethe made this observation about the senses, was that the sun builds the eye to perceive the light, and that the organs that are developed have to become selfless in order to serve the organism. So if the eye kept all the light and the perceptions for themselves, we wouldn't be able to become conscious of them. Or if the lungs kept the oxygen, etc., or the stomach kept the food for itself, then it has to kind of do a function and then give itself over to serving the organism for it to become in service of consciousness. So these are, and the spiritual senses are the same. So what is working upon the senses to build the spiritual and the soul senses? And the Christ. It's Christ who works upon us in our journey to transform the soul into a sense of emptying out, selflessness. The Christ can work in that, where the analog senses are built. That's and Sarah Coakley talks about that as well, through her silent prayer, through the use of semiotic symbol. You allow the Christ to come in and build the spiritual senses. So they both agree with that. And others, Plotinus, all these different Neoplatonists who talked about these three steps, all agree on this kind of process. And that's what but is, can we call this an imitation of Jesus? So Jesus had to empty himself in order to be able to receive the Christ being. And the Christ being, as Paul said, had to empty himself of his spiritual power to unite with the Jesus body. So there's a kenosis, or of the Christ being, as Paul calls it. And in the Greek Orthodox tradition, you have kenosis, which is the emptying out, the photismos, the enlightenment, and then theosis, which is the making divine of the human being. These three steps. So we have that kind of that process of the inner work, allowing the Christ to build the soul organs of perception, and then a second layer of the spiritual organs of perception. And then when I come to the third step, we'll work with a little bit on how the Bible or the gospel-based process of that is. So I then talk about the four elements of understanding, because this is, again, going back to the epistemology at a certain level of our first conversation, is what is epistemology? And Steiner develops in that book, The Stages of Initiation, these four layers. When we have, the physical world, we have an object that we can perceive, and the senses bring it to us. There's an image that is created, and the ego builds a concept. So we need a sensation, an image, a concept, and the work of the ego in the physical realm. When, however, we go into the soul realms, we lose the object. I mean, how do you perceive an angel? You don't. Some people might be able to say they can see it in a cloud or something, but generally the supersensible world doesn't have an objective object to perceive. So the object falls away. Now, Steiner says this is when imagination, when visions start, so not fantasies or hallucinations, but we can learn what he calls this first step of imagination, where we only then have the image, the concept, and the ego at work. So the imagination, the image, and the concept come together. And then we can go to the three higher layers, where even the image falls away, and then even the concept falls away, where we come to some higher layers of cognition that Steiner describes. I'm going to refrain from going into that now, because it would be one of those recordings where we just explore that thought in itself. But it's really is quite a central understanding that there are other realms than just the purely materialistic world that can be measured empirically, that require other forms of perception, require other forms of cognition to come to the lawfulness of how it works. And this is possible. There is no glass ceiling, as Kant would have us believe. There is no glass ceiling, but we have to move from one form of epistemology into another, and to become comfortable with that and to learn what that is one of Steiner's great gifts in the epistemology in the world. That's maybe just a small précis there. So in that we have, the imitation of Jesu, or imitatio Jesu, is a Christ mysticism in the Pauline sense. And then we have to learn how to read the Bible in two directions. And this is where I've, in the thing called it, calling it the Steiner said, you need to understand the historical Jesus in a spiritual way rather than in a historical critical way. Can we come to understand the historical Jesus out of the Spirit first? And I mentioned that he defines the change in theology over history, that before the Middle Ages, the theologians or the philosophers would experience the spiritual world, and out of experiencing the spiritual world would explain the physical world. And then that was lost. That capacity of perceiving like that has been lost, especially, say, in the Western tradition. In some indigenous traditions, that's still fairly available to people. But we lost that in the Western tradition. And so we then started the empirical science, learned to measure things, and then tried to explain the spiritual world out of the empirical measurement. And Steiner saw that as really difficult. He found that to be a difficult process, that and we now need to open up this process of understanding the spiritual laws to then understand the physical world again, theologically as well. So I then go into a small little section of transforming the senses. And again, this is a small little review that Steiner's doctrine of the senses goes beyond the 5 senses of touch, taste, smell, hearing, and sight. He adds another 7: life, warmth, movement, balance, word, thought, and ego, or the capacity to experience the essential being of another. So not just my ego, but can I sense the self or the being of something other than me? And some of these senses teach us about the world out there, and some of them teach us about the world inside us. So the one that teach us about, or allows us to understand inside us, are life, movement, balance, touch, smell. The other ones teach us about the world out there, and these transform into the higher senses. So sight becomes spiritual seeing or imagination in the third eye, and then imagination. But then we have that sense of the hearing, the sense of sound becomes spiritual hearing, and the sense of thought becomes this inspiration, the communion with the essential being of another. I had a picture I wanted to share, maybe just in case people, I might just share this image. So that anyone who is watching this video can understand this as a visual. So we see here, this is a diagram that Steiner drew during one of his lectures, that you see the 12 senses, with this line here being the line of what happens inside the human being and what happens out there. So you got taste, sight, warmth, hearing, word, thought, and ego is about being able to perceive the world around us, whereas the life, movement, balance, touch, and smell are about what's in us. And then as we transform these, we see, the sense of sight becomes the spiritual sense of imagination. He has these transition moments. Hearing becomes inspiration. Thought becomes intuition, with the ego sense moving into the essential being. And then what he says, which is, I think, really interesting for the process of contemplative phenomenology, is we can also transform these inner senses. And as we transform these inner senses, we come closer and closer to developing a higher organ of perception that's called the experiencing the mystical union of the divine. So mystical union is an inner experience in having transformed some of these, especially the sense of smell, where we can actually develop an organ that allows us to experience mystical union, which is quite an intricate doctrine of the senses. But again, you've got the analog there of the physical senses, which is more than just seeing and hearing and speaking. So there's a whole section there that also requires further unpacking. Then I try to, in the last part, talk about the Bible-based method. So Steiner gives this lecture called The 3 Paths to Experience the Soul of Christ. And he talks about, in the early Christian times, that was the Bible. And then we have the second experience, which be that of Paul at Damascus, where we have a personal experience of the light body of the resurrected Christ. And then there's a third one, which we will come to later on, I think in the next chapter, which is, Christian initiation today, in a modern sense. So I decided in the thesis just to focus on the biblical based one, because that's the basis of theology. Theology is trying to systemize, explaining what the Bible means. That's a very simplistic way of defining it. But the art form, people read the Bible, read the text, and then we create philosophy out of it, or theology out of it. That's the process of theology. So using the Bible as a way to develop these senses is also important. And just put very simply, Steiner speaks very strongly in the sense that the Gospel of John is the core text for that, and that it is divided into 2 halves. So the central point of the Gospel of John is the raising of Lazarus. And he talks about, in the old initiation schools, you would have 2 processes in your teaching in the privacy of, under the guidance of an initiate. You would school the soul body, And then after a certain time, you would have a temple sleep, and into the soul body, all the sort of wisdom would become conscious. And then you go through a second process whereby you would be prepared for what was then called the temple death. And then that would be imprinted, what was conscious in the astral body, as we call it in Steiner's in anthroposophy, became then imprinted into the life body, and it became personal, knowledge at a deeper level after this temple death. And Steiner said we no longer have mystery schools like that. Every human being needs to take their own journey, and the Gospel of John is designed that the first half prepares us for, through meditation. He says we can't do the same process as an initiation school. We've got to meditate the first half of the gospel. So especially the 7 signs. So the 7 miracles that are performed in the first half, culminating in the raising of Lazarus as the 7th sign, are kind of the preparation of the astral body for higher knowledge. And then we go into the second half of the Gospel of John, which really, starts in chapter 13 with the washing of the feet. It's the last 24 hours of Christ's life, and there's 7 steps that he describes in the crucifixion of Christ that we as human beings can understand. As he calls them like a gamut of feelings. We almost have to not meditate the second half, but we have to go through a transformation of feelings on things like experiencing the washing of the feet, or the flagellation, the crowning of thorns, the bearing of the cross, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection, that we can actually go a process of feeling that how life itself presents that to us. So one of the examples would be, when we do something, we will receive criticism and scorn. That's almost like a flagellation. And we can allow those feelings to bring about a sort of an imitation of Christ. And the first half, I would say, is the imitation of Jesus, and the second half is the imitation of Christ. And the first half builds the soul senses, and in the meditation, and we go through a sort of a temple sleep in the middle of that. And then the second half, through the experiencing of the feelings as an inner trial, is then how we awaken the Christ and the spiritual senses. So that's a very brief, succinct review of what that actually means. In the thesis, I couldn't unpack that again, and that part of this part of the chapter requires its own book on exploring the method in much more detail than that. But what we do see is that there is a sense of commonality in these 3 steps of what Sarah Coakley uses as the Neoplatonic or Plotinus's path of the reversal of the emanation of the one, of purification, illumination, and then reunion with the one. She uses purgation, illumination, unity. The Eastern tradition uses katharsis, photismos, and theosis. Steiner uses, especially in his knowledge of the higher worlds, preparation, enlightenment, and initiation. They are these 3 classic processes that seem to be, being reworked in the mystical traditions of the Western tradition. So I think we're getting there, possibly to close to the end. At the end, I go through the 2 problems of the false initiation, which we spoke about last time. Is it possible, if this is all just put into the hands of an individual, can you go through a false initiation? And Steiner is very clear about what we need to prevent that under guidance, tutelage, community, being very clear about the guidelines for making sure that you don't have a false initiation. But the other question that was asked, what do we do in the meantime? Because this is a long path. To go through the Gospel of John like that and start developing higher senses is not a quick path. And my answer to that was Steiner talked about it. Well, it's just like any other science. My favorite version of this was, my cousin was a mathematician, and he used to deride us because he was older than us, and we were all at school, and we said, "Oh, are we doing maths at school?" He said, "You're not doing maths at school, you're doing arithmetic, and then you'll do geometry, and then you'll do algebra, and then you might do calculus, and with time you might do mathematics. But none of you will actually do mathematics because, and to go through those schoolings, like the apprenticeship, the journeyman, the master, go through a bachelor, a master's, a doctorate, you can't expect to make a contribution to knowledge in your first paper at university. You've got to spend time in the discipline reading, and it's the same with these spiritual senses, reading, using the Bible in this way. You start the process, and you'll be surprised how quickly, by reading other mystics, by reading other texts, and working with the Gospels, with the Scriptures in this artistic way, using it as art and symbol, because that's probably what I didn't say. We really need, both Coakley and Steiner talk about using the Scripture as symbol by which we can contemplate to allow these higher knowledges to work on us. So this, how do we work with symbol, could be another discussion in a moment. And then, so that was those two questions. At the end, I'll bring a little example of something that came my way of, how could this method really work in the world as part of the answer to that. And I came across the work of Leslie Kean in a book called Surviving Death. And I think there was a Netflix series made on the back of that, where she, as a journalist, starts to explore and the noetic sciences, basically. And one of the interesting, relevant as a bridge to chapter 4, was one of the interesting areas that she came across was, well, there's a lot of children having experiences of previous lifetimes. And how do we actually test them? And she went into this realm of the noetic sciences, and they've been doing tests for up to 50 years, if not more longer, on these cases. And their scientific method was to make sure that the interviews or the data that they were collecting were from the memories of children that hadn't yet been affected by their parents' conditioning, or, reflecting on their experience 20 years later. And there was one case where the father was a real skeptic on this. So he just wrote this stuff down as the child was saying it. And so they've become, pure text, pure data, because the child was not going, oh, I remember when we talked about it, it was just like, I've just got this stuff. And there's more and more evidence now that there is possibly people, reading, experiencing previous lifetimes, and there are ways of recording it in a pure data fashion, rather than what they call a secondary psychic influence of, the parents' questioning, or, all those things that come in. So that's a really interesting read in her book, what's called Surviving Death, Leslie Kean, if one is interested in seeing a more sort of empirical scientific approach through the noetic sciences to these questions. And she herself then undertook the testing and kind of proved to herself, yeah, this stuff is really interesting. We can actually have a process whereby our sort of psychic experiences can become objective and rational, which is kind of what we're trying to develop. Yeah. So I think that might cover the review. Sorry, it was long, but it is a massive section of the method.
It's so rich, Jude. It's just a joy. It really is a joy listening to you. Unfortunately, so like the mindset like jumps off. Just like there's so many interesting points, and that I want to mention a point here, but I want to preface this by saying you mentioned so many areas that could be deepened, and I feel like I'm assaulting your wonderful production by just choosing one, and I could have chosen various angles to go down here, but a couple of things happened to me this morning which have led to the choice that I'm going to go down, and I'll tell you about those experiences this morning. I think what you were saying, you mentioned Kant at somewhere towards the middle of your presentation there, and I think it is this whole question of what is real is at the heart of this question. And Steiner makes this statement multiple times. We're all Kantians, and I want to unpack that. What does he mean? What does it mean to be a Kantian? A Kantian means somebody who only says what you can see with the senses is real. And Steiner, when he wrote GA3, Wahrheit und Wissenschaft, Truth and Knowledge, or Truth and Science, he talks about the importance of Fischer and Remke, and that they opened his eyes to this notion of experience. It's like, for him, he describes how this was the point where it's like his development took a radical turn, like in the direction it ended up becoming clearly exposed in the philosophy of freedom.
Yeah.
So what is this? Essentially he's saying that all experience is real, and it's only with thinking that we label it as real or unreal. And this is where the first major problem happens, is that what we're doing is all of the inner experiences and the potentials for visions, when we're talking about mystics and that type of thing, they become labeled as unreal. Whereas if we go back
unreliable.
You're absolutely right. It's a secondary aspect. We do have to be careful. But the Kantian error is in labeling experience as real or unreal. It's not. But that doesn't mean we can't have experience that deceive us. But even the experience is not deceiving us. We, with our thinking, are deceiving ourselves about the interpretation. So it's not the experience. The experience is real, and how we deal with that, conceptually, is where we enter into the realm of truth or falsehoods. And so one of the things I loved in your description in today and in the second half of this third chapter here is how you unpack this idea of sensory data, image-based data, inspirational or concept-based data, and then intuition. And this morning, when I was rereading your work, I was immediately drawn to a guy called Thomas Traherne. I don't know if anybody knows him.
Yeah.
And he's got. I'm going to read one of his quotes, which there are nearly a dozen similar ones, but I'm just going to choose one of them here, which is this one here. This is from Centuries 1, verse 29. It says, "You never enjoy the world aright till the sea itself floweth in your veins, till you are clothed with the heavens and crowned with the stars, and perceive yourself to be the sole heir of the world, and more so, because then are in it who are every one sole heirs as well as you, till you can sing and rejoice and delight in God as misers do in gold and kings in scepters. You never enjoy the world." And this key phrase here, enjoy the world, it appears 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, at least 10 times in his various meditations.
Yeah.
And this is at the heart of the process. As I listen to you describe this sense, image, concept, ego, or intuitive, this is at the heart of it, that we enter into, we of our own free will, we enter into the being, rather than seeing it just, it's with the senses, and rather than just seeing this as an image in front of us, and rather than just understanding it conceptually, we actually live through that being. And I thought I really enjoyed the way you brought that out in this text as a way of understanding. It's how the mystical experience goes beyond sensory, and how this is linked to this contemplative theology that you're referring to.
Yeah.
And there's one more person I'd like to bring into it's like that particular point is you've obviously got the Irish poet writer George William Russell, who wrote The Candle of Vision, and if anybody has read that, this is this instinctive impression you get by reading this type of art, the schooling I'm talking about, the third part of your presentation today. How do we school ourselves in this? So you read somebody like A.E. or George William Russell in The Candle of Vision, and the essence is that it's like by living yourself into this other being, that it reveals its nature to you. So those the physical boundaries that we have with the senses, the limit of just the image, the limit of like just conceptual understanding fades as we live into that being. But we need those steps that you outlined there before that final living within can actually become something real in us.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great contributions of Steiner, is to have, conceptualized the steps of other processes of cognizing the subtle realms, and to busy ourselves with that is quite important. To give ourselves permission to work in that way, firstly, because we've understood a process. I think there's a lot of skepticism around those processes not being valid, as but actually finding a way that they've been described and be made available so that people can actually understand that process is really important. Yeah, so I'd be interested in how Craig or Raynand are thinking.
Sorry, again, I'm trying to minimize all this time because of my background, but just a few commentaries on the senses. I remember when I was doing my literature reading in anthroposophy, Steiner specifically mentioned that, well, in fact, I mentioned this already before, that we only create image or an idea based on the perception. So it is through the senses that we create the physical reality, or we get that information from the physical reality, and we decide and we judge things based on that perception, collective perception. So I said, what if we don't have perception at all? What if we don't have senses? Well, for sure, that could be, probably you don't have a physical participation if that happens. I don't know. Because physical participation requires senses.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting theme that I would like to unpack a little bit maybe in a moment, about how symbol works with that. Is the move from the physical senses to the next layer where you don't have the physical participation is a really important schooling in this method.
And it's interesting too on that, because I've scratched down a couple of notes. Like that's something I strongly connected with, is your biblical path, how you explain that around, that process of schooling, because it's still very much active. It's not a passive path of schooling, but it's different. We're not forcing. It's not something you can force, and there's, I think almost what you potentially maybe going to talk about is it's almost a dulling of the senses in some respects with that path, because the way you've explained that the biblical path in particular, I feel like that that opens that up for a lot more people to be able to actually work with that text in that way, in those different sections to see what emerges.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, seeing the Bible as symbol or as art, the artwork of theology, you could say. It's, for me, it's a relief, because I think that's where Steiner's lever was he was seeing a lot of, literal, historical, critical, archaeological, proven truth is only, and then you come, is the only way of coming to this Jesus the man, as it became known, of the historical quest for Jesus, and then you land up, doubting everything because all of the accounts contradict each other. And Steiner opens that up and says each of the accounts is an account of that person's experience of the Spirit. So Luke writes differently to John because that was how he was schooled, and through his initiation could experience these things. And so he wrote his story in the analogies and metaphors for his community. And so you have, I remember in doing my master's, there was a guy one of the tutors had just written a book on the Gospel of Mark and had created a whole theology about Rome and the household in the Roman community out of the Gospel of Mark, who is written predominantly for the Roman community. And so there are attempts, of interpreting the Gospels to give a teaching that becomes relevant for a community. But to actually go, okay, so let's look at the marriage feast of Cana and, see it in these 4 steps that I've described. Yes, it was a literal event, absolutely. But how is the Christ who is at work throughout evolution actually manifesting through the story? How does the story become a mythological or a symbolical text? And how do I, as a reader, combine, in the sense of Gadamer, where he called this the fusion of horizons, through the language, through my questions, through my dialogue with my community, my horizon as the reader, the horizon of John, the evangelist, and the text as the medium need to fuse. And therefore we break beyond time, we break beyond the need for the literal interpretation, where it can now become, this text actually says something to me about my capacity as a spiritual being, my own journey towards theosis or becoming divine. And in meditating on the events of the narrative, something is transformed within me. And this is how Steiner talks about symbols. So in the sense of what Raynand was talking about, I would be keen just to, if I could, talk a little bit about how Steiner works with symbol in the sense of a modern mystic, because we really, if we're going to go this path, we need to learn as theologians, as people of faith, as people on a journey for higher knowledge, how to actually engage with art and symbol in a way where it works in this way. You can go to an art gallery and look at a piece of art and it affects you, but we're talking about a slightly different process here. So Steiner's concept of symbol, and I think this fits in with Sarah Coakley's and most mystical, someone like Hildegard of Bingen, she painted these incredible pictures that are meditations. They are mandalas of they're not just paintings of what she's been talking about. They are icons, the icons of the Eastern Church, where if you look at it, the being that's depicted in the icon becomes present in your soul. It's not just a drawing, it's a tabernacle, it's the presence through the symbol. And so Steiner describes a process. He famously describes a creation of the Rose Cross meditation. And he says there's actually a very powerful lecture that he gives called, What is Mysticism? And he describes this process where we take things we can perceive in the outer world, like Raynand was saying, where we need the physical senses to engage, like a rose, the green leaves, the sap, and burnt wood. So stuff we can actually see in the outer world. And then he says, we can apply certain feelings to a rose. We can apply a feeling of how the green sap turns into the red petals, and get a certain sense of innocence in that in that process. So we develop on hand of the physical engagement with the senses. We can already start to have particular feelings, not just random feelings, but particular feelings that are associated with that phenomenon. And then you take those different elements out of the physical world and create a symbol that you can't find in the physical world, like a black cross with 7 red roses on it. You won't find in nature. So it becomes a bit like Jesus on the cross, you know, where if you grew up Catholic as a child, possibly even longer ago, the picture of Jesus on the cross wasn't about a dead man on the cross. It revealed to us that God lived beyond death. You know, that was your inner feeling that arose because you could see the symbol produced this effect within us that Christ survived this. And that's a real hope feeling in me. And so when we construct, and in that sense, the stories, the narratives in the gospel, especially of John, have this quality of the way they are written, have a story that is way beyond the physical narrative. And if we then take that feeling and drop it into our soul, that's the mystical side. So you have the sort of the empirical side, and then you can drop the symbol altogether and allow the result of that work to be and this is where I think Sarah Coakley talks about silent prayer. Like, you just have to be let go and let God. You've got to just let the effects of the meditation, let the effects of the symbol, you know, percolate in your soul. And through allowing the Christ to enter into that, it becomes something. And that is then what comes forth as knowledge. That's his mystical process. So he sees a modern mystic as a balance or a combining of the empirical and the mystical together, rather than just, oh, I'm going to go and, you know, into myself and find something in mystical union and talk about that. This binding it to a symbol is an ensuring of the production of knowledge that is, you know, reproducible in the world of language, if that makes sense as to how I'm trying to describe it. And if we use the Gospels in that way, they actually transform our soul qualities.
I'd like to further develop what you're talking there about, Jude, to like presence through symbol, and make it real in a different way, but I'm still saying the same thing as you.
That's important.
Yeah. When we watch a film, images creating something alive in ourselves. But when we go down the path that you're describing, is we begin to like take active control and intensify that work. So it's the imagery that we have working within ourselves. And it's this there's like a feedback loop going on that creates like an increased sense of reality of this inner life. We all recognize that we have an inner life when we watch a good film. We sort of like become way happy or come away like it's like thinking about things.
And some
and that process
for a long time, yeah.
Exactly, and we turn that process. We need to turn that process inside. So that was one of the thoughts I was thinking as you're describing. But there are a dozen different aspects, and I'm just going to pick one here to perhaps develop it. Is the importance of conversation, which we obviously are engaged in here, in that process as well, so that there is a danger of losing yourself in imagery, it becoming not related to reality. And this is where conversations are like to make sure that we don't become like too abstract, like too distant from this process, because we're involved in a truth seeking process, and we are all susceptible to making error. And this is how one of the ways in which I think conversation, this key idea in Christianity, that's like when two of us are together, I am also with you. that it's like we create that space so that the corrective aspect, if I can put it like that, or the truth aspect can live within that conversation. And it's a lot more difficult to assure oneself of that if I'm just involved in, to use a derogatory terms, like navel gazing.
Yeah. And the other side of that, so there's the one of the navel gazing side. Of the other side of it is symbol isn't just any random thrown together imagery. It's actually got a lawfulness to it. And that's why the Gospels are so important, because you could say, it's quite popular to say, oh, well, they just wrote whatever they wanted to. But Steiner's picture is, no, they were writing, they wrote it in such a way that their experience could be revealed through the narrative. And that's why there's different forms of Gospels, but they are symbolic in nature. And they're not just a sort of a 60-year later handed down tradition that someone then eventually put to text. They really are. Symbol can't just be made up. I mean, you've got to make it up, knowing the lawfulness or knowing what you want to reveal through that particular kind of symbol is really important. It's not just a sign or a piece of abstract art.
Yeah.
If you know what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'd like to add something else, but I don't want to dominate too much. Craig or Raynham, did you want to add something there?
I think you're fine. I'm still trying to digest everything you said.
Okay. So again, building on what you're saying there, Jude, is one of the things you can come across reading Steiner is the indications or the practices that you can do to develop imaginal consciousness, and you'll get to something like, just imagine it's like a triangle, and this shouldn't be a stationary triangle, but you're moving. It's continually in movement, but always obeying the laws of triangularity, if I can put it like that. And so a novice coming to that question can say, what value can there be in month after month after month, or perhaps even years, continually going through this repetitive process? And it is this schooling oneself into bringing to life this imaginative capacity that we have. And then what happens one day is within that image, something new produces itself, something you don't know the provenance of it, and it needs to be investigated. You can't just take it to be true just because it popped up in your head, but a life begins to happen within that environment that you have created.
I think you've described it really well, this hard work of learning to perceive imaginatively, because we're so used to perceiving through the physical senses, and we have to school the mind to work with image. And only then does that second layer of emerging stuff come, but it's a long journey. Yeah. Craig, did you want to?
I would like to add some commentaries as well about physical senses and physical experiences. Steiner mentioned as well that our life on earth is both physical and spiritual. So we can relate spiritual sense to our degree of consciousness or awareness. And it appears to me that our consciousness also relies on our physical experience. I mean, we are growing, we are developing our consciousness based on our physical experiences or collective physical experiences as well. At the end of our lifetime, maybe. So our consciousness is also collective of all our physical experiences. So that being said, I think what Steiner said is really sensible, that this has to be physical. Has to be physical and spiritual journey.
Sure.
And lensing from and it resonates to my Christian belief that what we do here on earth affects our spiritual life. So that really is sensible to me lensing from both the anthroposophy of Steiner and the Christian aspect.
Yeah, you're really highlighting the inseparability of matter, soul, and spirit. That, you know, how do you perceive through that, rather than saying, now I'm perceiving physically, now I'm perceiving spiritually. It's like, how do I see all three through the physical? Yeah, absolutely. It's a really important differentiation, that I think. Yeah. And seeing how the physical affects the spiritual. Yeah, very pertinent. Yeah. I'm going to have to wrap it up soon. Any last?
Thanks for sharing your work with us, Jude. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.